Alicia, you might want to turn off your mic. Good day, everyone, and apologies for keeping you waiting. We're going to get started very, very soon. I'm just going to give everyone a couple of minutes to file in, and then we will get started. So welcome. Good morning, everyone. We're just waiting for everyone to file in. Thank you. Apologies, everyone. We were just having some technical difficulties with one of our panelists, but I think that panelist has now joined us. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are in the world, to everyone. I am Janive Remy, director here at the Sridath Ramphal Center for International Trade, Law, Policy and Services in the beautiful Barbados Cave Hill campus of the University of the West Indies. This webinar, entitled Road to MC12, is part of a special SRC lunchtime chat series, which we are proud to be hosting together with our esteemed colleagues at the Geneva mission of the OECS Commission, represented here today by Mr. Joel Richards, who is the Senior Technical Specialist in Trade at the mission. This is the first of two webinars in the lead up to the ministerial conference, the 12th ministerial conference, where we aim to gain the perspectives from some of the practitioners, negotiators who are closest to the negotiations and the issues, and they are more or less on the ground in Geneva or have been close to the ground. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the WTO setup, the ministerial conference is being held. It happens every other year, and this year it's being held from the 30th November to the 2nd of December. This MC12 is quite special because it has been delayed on account of COVID-19, and it's being held in Geneva, where the previous plan was that it would be held in Kazakhstan. But it's also a big one, not least because of so many new areas that have arisen for the consideration of the trade body, like what to do about plurilaterals and the joint statement initiatives, and COVID-19 and health issues, and the global supply chain interruptions, the role of the WTO on the environmental issues in light of the recently concluded COP26. These are some of the new burgeoning issues. But we also have the legacy of the older issues that continue to bedevil the system, some dating back from the mandate from the Doha Development Agenda in 2001. And it is also where many of the issues relating to reform still have not been settled. It's also the first conference under the new leadership of our Director General, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. So some might see this, perhaps a little unfairly, as the test of her stewardship in this new role. In this first webinar, we want to discuss some of the older issues. We have called them in the flyer legacy issues. To help unpack these issues and, in a sense, help to crystallize them for those of us, especially in the Caribbean region and CARICOM, we have some of the old hands, I like to call them. They're not old, but they have old hands because they've been dealing with these issues for such a long time. I will introduce them a little bit later, but they really commend themselves because of their close, intimate knowledge of the ins and outs of the major players, the big players, the small players, the issues themselves, and the labyrinthine structures of the WTO, what works, what doesn't work, where to go to resolve issues, etc. Of course, these are critical and sensitive times in the negotiations. So I count us very lucky to have these esteemed panelists speak today on some of the issues, and they may even have to run off in the middle of the webinar because of other pressing demands. Before I turn to introducing the panelists, let me just quickly hand over to my co-host, Mr. Richards, who will briefly set out and set the stage and the background for the ensuing discussions by our panelists. Over to you, Joel.
Thank you very much, Jan. And I'm not sure if you're putting me in the category of an old hand as well, but I would welcome it if you mean in terms of experience. Madam Chair, esteemed panelists, ladies and gentlemen, the pleasure is certainly mine to deliver brief remarks on behalf of the Commission of the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, which has the added honor of partnering with the SRC in hosting this public webinar, the first of three, two prior to MC12 and one post MC12. This collaboration is a concrete example of how academia and policymakers can combine to contribute to the public good of knowledge and experience sharing, especially on issues which are normally removed from the prying eyes of the public. We are about 2 weeks away from the 12th WTO Ministerial Conference. It is certainly an exciting time to be in Geneva and to have a front row seat to the horse trading, for want of a better word, that is still on the way. There's a great deal at stake. As Jan said, it has been 4 years since the last ministerial conference, an unprecedented situation for the WTO. Therefore, there's an extent to which the organization needs an injection of new political dynamism. Much has happened since MC11 in 2017. We are currently faced with the worst global public health pandemic of a generation. This has had a knock-on effect on the global economy, supply chains, trade, and investment. There's also the wider debate about access to medical technologies, especially for developing countries and LDCs, and the WTO's own role in unlocking manufacturing capacity, addressing export restrictions, and putting a framework in place to ensure that when the next pandemic or global disruption comes around, we are much better prepared. Of course, there are also other important issues on the agenda. The 20+ years of negotiating a fisheries subsidies agreement need to be brought to an end. Here, sustainability meets trade, and as responsible members of the global community, we have an interest in ensuring that we preserve the resources of the ocean for current and future generations. There's a Greek proverb which says that a society grows great when old men, and I'm sure women, plant trees in whose shade they shall never sit. The fisheries agreement is an opportunity for our ministers to plant a tree, which will provide shade to for generations to come. Other areas of interest for us include WTO reform, and we are likely to see the establishment of some sort of working group or alternative mechanism to carry on work on reform post MC12. Of major importance for us is the reconstitution of the two-tiered dispute settlement system of the WTO. On special and differential treatment, we have long-standing interests. I'm sure that Mr. Keem and Ambassador Wayne and other panelists will speak to these, and as such, I won't dwell too much on those. Suffice to say that I have had major discomfort with the lack of willingness to engage on SDT on the part of developed members, including with respect to the G90 10 agreement-specific proposals. In closing, I want to end on two notes. These are trust and credibility. There has been a major trust deficit in international affairs more broadly, one which we are seeing at the WTO and in other multilateral fora. MC12 is an opportunity to bridge this trust deficit. On credibility, MC12 also presents a major credibility challenge for the WTO. I am a big believer in multilateralism, and we cannot solve global problems strictly with local and bilateral solutions. However, this hasn't stopped many from questioning the purpose of the WTO. If we fall short at MC12, then we damage the credibility of the organization, perhaps irreparably. If we succeed, especially on the big ticket issues, then we buy the WTO some goodwill and firmly restore it to a pride of place among the other institutions of global governance. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the clock is ticking and the world is watching. Thank you.
Excellent opening remarks, Joel. I feel like you should be a panelist, but we claim you as one of the co-hosts. And I think you've teed up the issues really, really nicely for our illustrious panel to dig in on and jump in on. So let me, without further ado, just give very brief introductory remarks about the panelists. I'd like to introduce, first of all, and I will be introducing them in their order of appearance, Dr. Edwini Kessie, who is a staff member at the WTO and has been there since 1995. Although he's worked in different divisions, including the Council and Trade Negotiations Committee Division, the Development Division, and Institute for Training and Technical Cooperation, he currently sits as the Director of the Agriculture and Commodities Division and is the head of the newly established WTO Delivery Unit. That explains why he's here on our panel today. Agriculture is one of the big issues, obviously, and delivery is also equally important in getting us through MC12. Dr. Kessie has taken leave previously from the WTO to become the Chief Trade Advisor of the Pacific Island countries and CEO of the Office of Chief Trade Advisor located in Vanuatu. So the obvious affinity with smaller countries like ours in the Caribbean places him as an esteemed panelist here today. Thank you, Dr. Kessie. I also want to introduce Mr. Mustaqim Dagama. Until recently, Mustaqim was a counselor with the South African Mission in Geneva and accredited to the WTO and the UN. He covers rules, disciplines, the DSB, the Dispute Settlement Body, TRIPS, and TRIMS. He's currently the Director of the Legal International Trade and Investment Directorate at the Department of Trade, Industry, and Competition in South Africa. And Mustaqim is no stranger to the SRC. We've had him on a number of our events before, and he is a very popular and dynamic speaker. So we look forward to hearing from him. Miss Alicia Greenidge is an international trade expert with over 25 years experience in international trade negotiations and WTO practice and procedures. She's a founder and president of an expert advisory practice in Geneva, Summit Alliances International Development Trade Solutions, established in 2009. Ms. Greenidge also served for 10 years as the Assistant Deputy Chief of Mission in Geneva, Senior Counsel and Trade Negotiator for the United States government before the WTO on several trade issues, including services trade negotiations, TRIPS, electronic commerce, trade remedies, dispute settlement, and deliberations before a number of WTO bodies. Thereafter, she served a stint as the first woman Director General of a Geneva-based industry trade association. And explaining her busyness and the number of jobs that she actually currently juggles, Miss Alicia Greenidge has indicated that she may have to drop off at some point during this call. So Alicia, we're so happy to have you at the start here for our panel discussion. And last but not least, Ambassador Wayne McCook. Ambassador McCook is an experienced diplomat, facilitator, and negotiator. He has served as Jamaica's permanent representative to the UN office at Geneva and to the WTO and international organizations in Geneva, Vienna, and Rome. He's been ambassador to the People's Republic of China, deputy permanent representative and delegate to the Sixth Committee at Jamaica's mission to the United Nations in New York, and even deputy head of mission at Jamaica's embassy to the United States. In multilateral fora, he has served at various times, including as chairman of the Rules Negotiating Group in the WTO, president of the Group of 77 on China, coordinator of the ACP group at the WTO, and has now joined as an advisor to the CARICOM Office of Trade Negotiations. So this is their illustrious bios. I'm going to jump straight into the discussion. Edwini will start us off, giving his perspectives as head of the agriculture and delivery units about where things are and what CARICOM countries may want to pay close attention to during these MC12 negotiations. Thank you, Edwini.
Thanks, Yaniv, and I'd like to also thank all the other organizers. And also, I can see from the participants list, I see a lot of my friends. And so what Yaniv didn't say is that I also have a very close connection to the Caribbean. So I have a lot of friends in the Caribbean, and definitely I used to cover the Caribbean for the WTO. So I built a lot of friendships across the region. So it is a place which is very close to my heart. To start with, I think because of time considerations, I'll just go straight into agriculture. Certainly, I think it is one of the most difficult issues, as all of you are aware. The agriculture negotiations actually preceded the Doha round, mainly because countries were not satisfied with the Uruguay round results. But then because of negotiating fatigue, they agreed to continue negotiations on agriculture. Now, it has been one of those intractable issues, and whether it's legacy issues or not, but I think, as we normally say in the WTO, agriculture holds the key to unlocking progress in other areas. Without progress in agriculture, it will be very difficult even to make progress on the new issue. So it is quite important. Now, following the Nairobi decision in 2015, where members agreed to eliminate all forms of export subsidies, attention has mostly focused on domestic support, to a lesser extent, market access. And I think for domestic support, the figures are quite startling. The Cairns Group, in a number of submissions, have indicated that support, domestic trade distorting support or entitlements of members will soon reach $1 trillion. And if nothing is done, the figure would increase to 2 trillion by 2030. So in the negotiations, all members are agreed that we need to reduce overall trade distorting domestic support. Where they diverge is what should be the starting point. On the one hand, the exporting nations want all forms of Article 6 support to be part of the negotiations. On the other hand, you have key developing countries, China, India, ACP group, Caribbean countries obviously included. Their starting point is that we need to eliminate support beyond de minimis to level the playing field. And the reason why they say that is that currently we have only 32 members who have AMS beyond de minimis. So this enables them to concentrate their support on a few products, whereas many developing countries in the Caribbean, Africa, Pacific are only limited to the de minimis. So they can provide support only to 10% of the value of production of a product. So this is considered unfair because the US, as I said, is 19.1 billion, the European Union 72 billion euros, and Japan around 35 billion. And they can choose to concentrate that on a few products. So their starting point is that we need to do this as a first step before we tackle other issues. But this view is not shared by the other members. So I think Joel spoke about trust, and the idea of most of the countries, especially on the other side, is that all forms of Article 6 support will have to be considered. Now, in the negotiations, we have had a little bit of issues whether we should actually make a specific reference to AMS beyond de minimis. The view of the United States and other countries is that we shouldn't prejudge the outcome of the negotiations, and this will be more like a modality. So they do not want reference to AMS beyond de minimis. So what, as the chair is looking at various possibilities so as to be able to find a way out of this problem because it's one of the fundamental issues. Now, one of the reasons why the other side would also like all forms of Article 6 support, including de minimis support. India is the major user of Article 6.2 support, and it provides close to $25 billion a year under Article 6.2. So the other side would also like that to be part of the conversation, but ACP Group and Africa Group and others say 6.2 is a red line. So it's very difficult. In the chair's text, what the chair has been road testing is that all forms of Article 6 support shall be addressed in the negotiations on the understanding that they will be treated differently. As to whether the ACP Group, India and China will find comfort in that remains to be seen. But United States, the EU, the Keynes Group, they do not want specific reference to eliminate having a provision which will say that there will be no Article 6.2 support will not be subject to any reduction commitments. They think that it will prejudge the outcome of the negotiation. So we do have a little bit of a problem there. Then another issue is the principle of proportionality, which basically in its simplest form, it could be defined as that the contribution to be made by a member should be dependent on its contribution to distortions. There's broad agreement on that, but the current text focuses on members' entitlements, which China basically rejects because China's value of agricultural production is estimated to be around 2 trillion. And unlike other developing countries, the de minimis of China is 8.5%. So it gets 8.5% for product specific and then 8.5% for non-product specific. So 17% of 2 trillion, is I think close to 300 billion or something. So if you were to base it on the entitlements, then a country with China would have to make more. But then China comes in and says, well, look, we don't have to look at the nominal figure, but we also need to consider per capita support per farmer because they have close to 400 million farmers. So China's view is that if you take into account only if the sole criterion were to be the size of the entitlement, then it would be unfair. So we are trying to find ways to, I think broadly, most members subscribe to the proportionality principle, but there are various forms of expressing it. So the chair is looking at how maybe we need to combine ideas. Some countries have suggested that, it should be commensurate, proportionate, commensurate, equitable to the members' entitlements and the distortions caused by the support provided by a member. So we do also have a little bit of an issue there. Then on the green box, a number of developing countries, ACP Group, they have been heading the charge that we need to clarify Annex 2, which is the green box, because obviously a number of countries are providing a lot of support under the green box. But the European Union, the G10, they have come out clearly to say they do not support renegotiation of Annex 2, i.e. the green box. So we need to find language which will satisfy both sides. Now, my own assessment is that I think it's difficult, but it's not as difficult as public stockholding. We are trying, by the way, the chair is looking at the possibility of circulating a revised test maybe by the end of the week. So we are trying a lot of options as to how we can bridge the differences, but domestic support doesn't look as bad as public stockholding, which would be the next topic that I'll focus on. On public stockholding, there was a ministerial decision that we needed to have agreed on a permanent solution at MC11 in Buenos Aires. That was in 2017. Now, the basic problem is that the exporting countries have made a linkage with domestic support generally, mainly because of the market price support element of public stockholding programs. The other side, mostly ACP Group and others say, well, look, we should link the two, because it's quite clear that it is a separate mandate. But there are those who believe that because of the market price support element, we cannot have a permanent solution without prior progress in domestic support. So there's that linkage which has been made, and the chair in her report, which was circulated in July, made it clear that it is out of reach. You know, we have 2 weeks, and certainly it is out of reach to agree on a permanent solution within that short time frame. So the idea is to have a work program, which a number of countries are opposed to it. They think that a lot of work has already been done, so why do we need a work program? So developing countries are quite dissatisfied with that. But in the process, the chair has proposed that in the interim, we could possibly extend the interim Bali decision to PSH programs of least developed countries enacted after 7 December 2013. Now, with the LDCs, it's not very certain. Normally, it's very difficult for countries to say no to LDCs, but I think Caribbean countries, a number of African developing countries would also like to benefit. So, but the problem is that there isn't any agreement even on LDCs. And certainly a number of developed countries, the United States, the Keynes Group and others, they wouldn't like the Bali decision to be extended to new program, because as a condition for countries to be able to access the Bali decision, their PSH programs should have been enacted before 7 December 2013. So there are new programs. So countries like India or China may be interested in having the Bali decision extended to programs enacted after that, but that is a complete no-no for a number of countries, Brazil and others. So what the chair is possibly looking at is making a proposal that it should be extended to only LDCs, but obviously that will leave our Caribbean brothers and sisters very unhappy. So this is something that we need to look at. How do we make sure? Because I think the European Union has stated that they do not really mind if it's extended to Caribbean countries, because the Caribbean countries cannot distort international trade. But as you know, it's a problem. You know, can we come up with something which would only benefit African developing countries? Not many of them. My own country included, Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, Caribbean countries. I don't think the developed countries would really care if it's extended. But then, how do we get about it? You know, because of MFN and other issues. So we do have a problem. So I suspect that the chair may want to limit her proposal to extending it to all the LDCs, but we'll see. I think the ACP group would have their say, and they may say that, well, look, it should be extended much more broadly. You know, if countries are facing food security issues or challenges, regardless of whether they are LDCs or not, you know, countries are facing as a result of COVID and the rest. So with PSH, I think we do have a lot of difficulty there, mainly because, you know, it's not something that you can use language to just, you know, cover the differences. So as compared to domestic support, I think PSH is actually much more difficult. Now, turning to market access, the chair's proposal basically, because mainly the United States in particular, the US doesn't have so much interest in domestic support, but for market access, it does. So, but a number of countries are strongly opposed to negotiations on market access, mainly because, you know, we haven't done a lot of technical work. But the chair's text on the 215, job 215, a number of countries have criticized, including the European Union and the ACP group. The ACP group have sensitivities, mainly because of their long-standing preferences. They want to protect domestic production. So most of them there is a sequence between domestic support and market access. They would like to see a conclusion of domestic support or far advanced negotiations before we turn to market access. The European Union, on the other hand, their view is that in the history of the GATT WTO, we have never had negotiations only on agricultural market access. So it is agriculture and NAMA, but we also know that members don't have the appetite for NAMA. So it's very difficult. So what the focus is, how do we weaken the current language in the chair's text? Because a lot of the members, their criticism was that it was far too detailed, considering that it is an issue where, you know, we haven't done a lot of technical work. So this is what the chair is looking at, maybe to have a slimmed down version, but obviously that will piss off the US, but because the US is very happy with the current text, but a lot of countries have indicated the G10, European Union, ACP group, South Africa in particular has taken a very strong stance on the chair's proposal. So I think the chair is looking at how maybe we can salvage it. In particular, a number of countries raised concerns regarding paragraph 2 of the draft text of circulated by the chair. So this is where we are as far as market access is concerned. On SSM, I think the preponderance of views seem to indicate that in the absence of prior progress in market access, we cannot have a result on SSM. The Africa group made a proposal for an interim SSM, but there was this strong pushback against that proposal. So we are more likely to end up with a work program, and this is what the chair has proposed, that there should be work program post MC12. As I said, the fundamental difference is that a lot of the exporting countries, developed countries, believe that there is an inextricable link between market access negotiations and SSM. So we cannot basically agree on an SSM without corresponding progress in market access. So I think the most realistic thing is to have a work program on SSM. Turning to export restrictions. Okay, I'll be very brief. Turning to export restrictions, it's a very small issue. Basically, exempting WFP purchases from humanitarian WFP purchases for humanitarian purposes from export restrictions. Here again, we have only 2 countries which are objecting to. Tanzania is not so much. Tanzania is very concerned that sometimes the purchases of WFP may compromise the food security of countries. So that I know that Singapore and others are negotiating with Tanzania, and they may be able to find language which will satisfy. But India has linked it to broader PSH, so it remains to be seen. On export restrictions, it's more transparency. So I don't think, how do we improve the monitoring of the Nairobi decision? On cotton, it is quite clear that without prior progress on domestic support generally, it will be very difficult for us to make progress on trade distorting cotton domestic support. So here again, the chair has proposed a work program. And then the last, transparency. Basically, the chair has proposed a work program, and in it, the chair has drawn attention also to the capacity constraints of countries. So 1 minute, and I'll stop here, is that, as I said, the chair is looking at circulating a revised test by Friday, and she hopes that maybe it would strike a careful balance between the interests of the competing, but it's not very clear, but that's what she wants to do. And then, so hopefully by Friday, we would have the revised test. So I think I'll just stop here. Thank you very much, Johnny.
Thank you so much, Edwini. I really hate to interrupt an agriculture discussion because, as you can see, that itself could be an entire, could be the entirety of the MC12 negotiations. There's so many intricate parts of the negotiations, and you've done a great job in just highlighting in some detail what the issues at stake are and what are ripe for sort of agreement and what may not be ripe for agreement. I think we're going to broaden the discussion a little bit, and then we'll do a deep dive afterwards again. But I'm going to ask Alicia now, who sort of in her capacity as an advisor to the ACP and the LDC group, she works very much with a lot of different groups, to kind of contextualize what's happening in Geneva. We've heard a lot about agriculture, but what are sort of the other issues that are happening in Geneva that CARICOM states and in your constituents should really be mindful of for us to harvest in MC12? Alicia?
Thank you, Genevieve, and thank you to everyone at SRC, OECS, and to Joelle. I'm delighted to be here with this esteemed and outstanding group of personalities that I have the pleasure to have worked with over many years and intensely. From the vantage point where I am, I hope that I can set a little bit of the flavor that we're feeling in the trenches over here, and those who were Mustakim and Edwini also from his angle, and Joelle very much in the trenches, and Ambassador Makuk having been in the trenches but still very much keyed in. The members here, at least from the perspective of what I can see, is all of the members are incredibly charged and pulling their weight to achieve a successful outcome for MC12. Though with some trepidation there is a good spirit now. We're in the penultimate 2 weeks before the ministerial starts. There's a good spirit of driving work prioritized for outcomes in terms of decisions and action-oriented work plans for next year. The legacy issues, the term you use, Jean-Yves, I must admit perplexed me a bit, because I was wondering if this meant Doha, issues that were under the framework of Doha, but there were also those negotiations such as agriculture and services, which were launched before Doha and folded under the Doha framework. But fisheries subsidies negotiations, which is the signature multilateral negotiation in front of us right now that everyone is banking on. But there are others as well that different members are focusing on, is a Doha mandated issue. Without Doha having existed, there wouldn't have been a fisheries subsidies negotiations that we are in the midst of now. It's not to say that it would never have happened, but that is a legacy issue. The G90 agreement specific proposals, that's the African group, ACP group, and LDC group, have since before these negotiations under Doha were launched, have submitted proposals on special and differential treatment proposals throughout the existing WTO agreements for consideration. And we have the issues that were considered part of LDC ministerial decisions. Now, there is also the question of the legacy of the e-commerce decision. This is a decision that was agreed in 1998, yet still today there are campaigns across industries and stakeholders around the world to promote the extension of this decision, and others who want to dive more deeply into the work program to understand further the impacts on their realities and what would take them forward in their development policies. There is also the TRIPS non-violation complaints moratorium up for decision by the ministers. And these two became twins, the e-commerce moratorium and the TRIPS non-violation complaints moratorium became twins after 2005, when the non-violation complaints of the trade-related intellectual property rights agreement expired and needed to be renewed. I hope Mr. Mustaqim will be able to jump in and speak a bit to these moratorium, in particular, the TRIPS non-violation complaints moratorium. Now, perhaps partially a legacy issue would be the WTO reform agenda. And this agenda has been spilling into the WTO scene actually over time, probably since the WTO came into being. There were, quote, reform questions being put forward. The more recent lineup of WTO reform proposals came in the last, since the last ministerial conference. And these were mainly involving proposals to review all of the different pillars of the WTO, negotiating, monitoring, implementation, and the dispute settlement element, which is a huge challenge, as you well know. Everyone knows that what was called the jewel in the crown, the appellate body, lapsed into hibernation or non-existence, but there are definitely concerns across the membership on reforming the dispute settlement system. There is on the table a proposal to establish a working group on the WTO reform agenda. This proposal might be very important or interesting to a number of members because it may provide a structure so that everyone can participate and become more focused on what is needed. Till now, the proposals are a bit scattered in different fora and topics. Now, the spirit that appears to be moving now here seems to be predicated on members to resolve, to listen to each other, talk with each other, and find solutions. It seems to me a spirit of rebuilding trust. And I recall many of a negotiation over my my couple of decades plus time, where in the WTO things were tough, aggressive, sometimes blood was drawn. However, after the dust settled, everyone was still at the table, in the corridors, on the street corners, talking and trying to understand each other. More difficult circumstances for everyone, including developing countries, least developed countries, became acute with the decline in the spirit of compromise and trust in the last recent years. The paranoia barometer is decreasing, it appears. The temperatures sometimes rise, but they are quelled enough to do what I have seen in many of the negotiation at the WTO to explore some landings. The chairs of the negotiating groups are members too, but they have the delicate role of stewardship. However, that stewardship includes the similar ingredients that everyone searches for, which is listening, finding solutions, but most importantly, creating the conditions for members at this phase to meet with each other and propose an attitude of what to do in a way that they can actually achieve some results. A commitment to the WTO as a structure, I listened to Joel, what he said about being a multilateralist, is it takes time, but whatever time it takes, it's needed and patience is needed. Before you know it, the time is up. So it doesn't matter that it appears to take a little bit more time to engage. Many different cultures coming together, many different perspectives, economies. The leadership of the Director General, Dr. Ngozi, is a part of that renewed spirit of genuine interest in working together with a touch of compassion. Some areas will not be possible to achieve by MC12. However, these are intense negotiations in progress to map out the contours, the trajectory for outcomes by MC13. This means that next year, like the year before any ministerial conference, will be crucial, etching out realistic work and landings before 2023 arrives. I feel a sense of deja vu. And though Mustaqim, he came into my life more, I think around 2015, it feels like deja vu, as in the momentum is a little bit similar to me, the way it was before we went to Doha in 2001. While frustrations were high, developing countries and LDCs were part of setting the agenda in a more specific manner. It was not the optimal manner, and many developing countries and LDCs were frustrated. Nevertheless, there were many different pockets of proposals that had to take into account the diversity of the characteristics of the WTO. Doha was held 3 months after the attacks in September 2001. A new work program of work across a number of issues were in the package, and South Africa put the TRIPS and Public Health Declaration on the agenda, which was a separate but also agreed deal that year in Doha. Similarly, we are emerging from the global health and economic crisis of 2020 due to COVID-19, which we are still battling since the introduction of vaccines. Now, the TRIPS COVID-19 waiver proposal, ironically, also commenced by South Africa, and Mustaqim leading the helm, with quite a number of joint co-sponsors and groups in that proposal is also on the table. In addition, a broader WTO COVID-19 response is underway for discussion and decision at MC12. And I know I salute Edwini and his delivery unit, because I know they're deliberating and such sort of as worker bees in the process of Ambassador David Walker of New Zealand, who is the friend of the chair, Ambassador Dacio Castillo, chair of the General Council. Now, the other context that I feel in looking at these different layers is that when I think about this, and you think about what happened in the GATT system before, after World War II, the GATT was created. And here we're emerging from high casualties on record from the COVID global disaster. And whenever you have a situation of some sort of peril, and then members and countries trying to come together to rebuild, you have a hint of some opportunity, a spirit of trying to work together. And this is a COVID response initiative going on here in the WTO, which is permeating across all of the issues and areas. At the same time, with having looked at after MC11, issues that would make the WTO commensurate with the realities of today. Some of the realities of today, looking at many issues for castes of developing countries, are still realities of the future for them, because they're still in a place that need to be built further to be fit for purpose for any other new realities. So this is a strange feeling when we speak of legacy issues on the table. The Marrakesh Agreement, however a legacy it is an agreement where the fundamentals and the principles are still guiding all members, regardless of the issues they are concerned about. And whether we speak about reimagining ourselves or work and our life choices, the fundamentals such as consensus building, member-driven, non-discrimination, a machinery and framework that still make the WTO relevant to any issue that's on the table. And I know, Jeanine, you and Joël are going to have another session on the so-called JSIs, which an ambassador told me last week that, you know, that's not a new normal. It's actually the old normal coming back, the old normal of the Tokyo Round days. And at that time, maybe not as many members of the GATT were familiar with how to be a part of the agenda setting, and later in the Uruguay round would adopt the results of those plurilateral agreements without very much negotiation. So the question mark that lingers is, how do all members who have different natures and characteristics become a part of all of the agenda setting that's needed in the world today? And how do members work together and maintain those principles that are still in the Marrakesh Agreement? So rebuilding, battling and recovering from COVID is still creating what members are doing today, despite the collapse of the appellate body. Even exceeding countries in the accession process are mobilizing to be here and still push their accessions forward. If this system was so broken or so bad off, you would have a retreat from those who are in the process of acceding, and they're not. So I would say that the accession negotiation pillar is still alive. It's just a question of stabilizing the institution on the main issues that need to be resolved by MC12. So what I would say, just to close there, I highlighted a few of the issues that are aiming for MC12. There are other issues which are coming forward with work plans, such as the services negotiations. And I would just say that the so-called JSI on domestic regulations is to be concluded. And this is something independent of the work that is going on in the General Council. Yet that negotiation was linked to GATT's Article 6.4, and there is and that is another agenda that is a legacy agenda. And the Article 19 negotiations of the GATTs include, built into its infrastructure, the principle of negotiations in bilateral, plurilateral, and multilateral format. And that is part of the statute in those negotiations. And the main purpose for that, which is going into next year, is to give members, especially developing countries, as much flexibility as possible. The trade and environment issue is percolating. And this is a sign of the times as well, sort of back to back with the results from COP26. It's a question for the entire planet. It's a backdrop of not only saving the planet, but for new technologies, modernization, other divides that exist along with what will be needed. So I would just end with that context as part of the backdrop. At least what we see happening around the edges is that it's part of the legacy. The environment agenda was a part of the legacy too. And we're happy to be back to back with UNCTAD 15's conclusion, which was hosted by Barbados. and you know I have ancestry there. So I would just end at that point to give a flavor from at least my standpoint. I mean, Musakim may think I sound too optimistic. I don't know, but it's an optimism that I guess we need, like a life vest. Thank you, Janine. Thank you, Joelle.
Thank you so much, Alicia. I was thinking that you're quite positive about the prospects and tempering everything nonetheless with the reality. So thank you so much for that backdrop. I'm going to move because we only actually have about 20 minutes left, and I did want any of the participants who have questions, anything any of our speakers raised, to just type it in your chat function, and we'll try to get it at the end. But Mustaqim, over to you to go back down into some of the detail, I think, on the fisheries negotiations, and you have been served as a focal point for the ACP, and any of the other sort of legacy issues as we've described them of interest to the Caribbean countries. So over to you.
Jenny, thanks very much. Let me also thank others, or at least join others to thank the SRC and the OECS for arranging this meeting. Maybe, Genevieve, what I will do is I'll try to be as short as possible. But the one thing I want to put on the table is what are our expectations for an outcome at MC12? And I want to propose a formula. And this formula is as follows. There's an old English adage that goes to the extent, when you enter into a marriage, there's certain things you have to bring to stabilize that relationship. So something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue. And so if we look at the headlines of the ministerial conference, we see that blue figures predominantly, and this is the fisheries outcome. And of course, you also have other pillars that are built around this. Edwini has eloquently spoken about agriculture. Of course, there is the issue of e-commerce. There's the issue of pandemic preparedness and the TRIPS proposal, the waiver proposal that is still under discussion. And so the question is, what will we be able to harvest? Well, a very, very simple answer to this is it's complicated, it's difficult. This is the most difficult ministerial conference probably since the establishment of this organization. Why? Because of COVID. I think there are various restrictions that will make the interaction much more difficult. And so many of us have said moment of truth for MC12 should arrive before the ministerial conference. And I would agree with Alicia, if you look at the preparation for many of the ministerial conferences, Nairobi, for example, Buenos Aires, there is this busyness, but does this busyness actually translate into tangible outcomes? And so how can we ensure that we have these tangible outcomes? How can we ensure that the headline items, including WTO reform, is such that it is inclusive, that it speaks to the aspirations of developing countries? Because this is really why the Doha round was launched, was to address the issues that developing countries felt were at the center of the Doha development round. Many people will tell you that Doha is dead, but certainly Doha is not dead. There is a legal requirement to bring a round to an end. That round has not come to an end. And so from that perspective, we have to stop and ask ourselves, what is it that we want out of this relationship, and how can we be more inclusive? So very quickly on fisheries, what are the big issues there? To my mind, the biggest issue around fisheries would be developing country interest in firstly exploiting their fisheries resources in their immediate areas of control, in their territorial and exclusive economic zones, and also their offensive interest beyond those areas. And this is really important because if you think of the policy space that developing countries need to exploit these resources, and you look at the revised text that the chair circulated on the 8th, there's a few questions around. Firstly, is it development friendly? Secondly, does it allow developing countries to fully exploit their fisheries resources? And does it cater for the issues that we feel are important as developing countries, such as food security, dealing with our artisanal small-scale fishing, Many of us are not big subsidizers, but that doesn't mean that we will not develop our subsidization regimes. I think Edwini touched on this matter, that, at the inception of the agreement, you had big subsidizers and they want to maintain their advantages. And so as we look at SDG 14.6, we understand that it needs to be sustainable. And at the end of the day, special and differential treatment has a special mention in this outcome. And so from that perspective, it would be important for the Caribbean region to advocate for an outcome that is inclusive. The issue of special and differential treatment is something that is not settled in this agreement, not settled in the organization as such. And as a result, this has become almost an example setting exercise. The modalities around special and differential treatment that are being negotiated in the fisheries text will be a model for other outcomes and other settings of negotiations that are still ongoing. And so from that perspective, the very substantial link with the development debate is significant. So for instance, on special and differential treatment, there's been an ongoing process, but nothing has really changed. If you were at Nairobi and you were in Buenos Aires, you would know what the picture is. That picture has not changed. Developing countries are actively being denied their right to special and differential treatment, and various limitations are being proposed. So from that perspective, I would think from our fisheries outcomes, we would have to ensure that effective special and differential treatment would have to be negotiated. That text, we can find 5.4 that deals with a subset of special and differential treatment issues from a fisheries perspective, and having a carve out for so-called small players, a de minimis, is the bottom line for the ACP. I think as the focal point and the management team around this with the core group, we've always advocated that we are not all in the same position. Many of us are not big subsidizers. Many of us are not responsible for the sizable catches that are noted. And so if you really look at the catch statistics, we feel that some sort of exemption for countries below a particular level of global catch would be appropriate. What that level is currently being discussed. The chair has set it at 0.7%. We believe that is too low. That needs to be in excess of 1%, which gives the necessary policy space for countries to proceed. But more importantly, and maybe just ending on this note for fisheries, there are many other issues that are outstanding. We have 2.5 weeks, 3 weeks left until the ministerial conference. There's intense negotiation on various aspects of the chair's revised text. However, if we wanted to have an outcome, I think we have to become practical and really assess what's the most important things that we value. So special and differential treatment, clear guidelines on the legal disciplines that are to be agreed and how they are enforced. And if we look at the enforcement provisions, they still tend to follow the general outlines of the dispute settlement understanding. And if we do not amend those to apply more appropriate fisheries subsidies disciplines that may be agreed, I think we will have a problem. But nonetheless, there's been a constructive discussion and debate around those particular issues. The final word on pandemic preparedness and the waiver. We believe that good progress has been made on both fronts. The Walker process dealing with issues around pandemic preparedness, trade in health goods and services. And then, of course, the waiver discussions. Currently, the TRIPS Council is still in session. The chair has proposed a recommendation to the General Council meeting very shortly that the TRIPS Council continue its deliberations on the waiver process and report to the ministerial conference when it is in session. And so there also we have many outstanding issues, but we believe that if we really look at a constructive approach, we can try to find a landing zone before the ministerial conference. Genevieve, I'm going to leave it at that. I know that it's more useful to have questions coming from the floor, and I'm happy to take some of those.
Thank you so very much, Mustaqim, for that. I'm going to go quickly now to Ambassador McCook. Ambassador McCook, you have sat on both sides in a sense of the negotiations. You've been in the trenches with as a representative of a Caribbean country. You've also been part of the machinery of the Secretariat, working in the DG's cabinet in the previous administration. You are a CARICOM national. We've heard a lot of things about what's happening, about the status of the negotiations. What is the line, in your view, bearing in mind that there seems so much that's unresolved from just my appreciation of what the previous speakers have said? What is the line that CARICOM can kind of walk? Should it be pushing? Should it be in the background? What is the best course of action between now and MC12 for CARICOM countries on some of these older issues?
Thanks, Genevieve, and I'll go straight into it. I'll try to speak in bullet points because I'm conscious that we're running out of time. First, we should take note of the fact that the CARICOM membership of the WTO is almost complete. That is, Bahamas is the only CARICOM member who is in accession. That should tell us what the region's assessment of the value of the WTO is. And it goes to the importance of rules, especially for the weak and vulnerable. For the powerful, rules can be taken or left because they can use other means to achieve their objectives. For the weak and vulnerable, without rules, you're at sea. So I want to put that in context. The region has a strong systemic interest in the WTO's role, function, and preservation. I'll go quickly to say what I think the region should be looking at because the ministerials are as important for what they capture of the past work and more so for what they say about the future work. So MC12 has to be looked at in that context. I'll first start with looking to the future. For the region, I think we want to see a post MC12 WTO that first maintains and strengthens fairness, inclusiveness, and transparency. We must not take it for granted that the WTO is the only international economic institution where each member has a final say in each decision. It doesn't happen in the IMF and it doesn't happen in the World Bank because they have different structures, different purposes. But we shouldn't take it for granted that it exists in the WTO and must not be sustained through effort. Second is that we must see to the advancement of a meaningful trade and sustainable development agenda, not in lip service, but in practice. And I think the fisheries subsidies negotiation is beginning to lay a framework for that. Sustainable development is not new to the WTO. Edwina will know that in SPS, for example, there's a close linkage between what you do in WTO rules and the rules external to it that have to do with health and safety, and certainly in respect of the work in trade and environment, the work of the multilateral environment agreements. So I think that there is scope for a serious and considered engagement on trade and sustainable development that is not a placebo, that is effective and important. And we could also take inspiration from the work that was done on trade and natural disasters, in which a number of CARICOM members played an important role, at least in the study and the project overall. We must ensure that there continues to be a sustained technical assistance and capacity building and development focus in the post-MC12 WTO reality. We need to seek purposeful SDTs, that is special and differential treatment. And I won't go over, Mr. Kim has made the argument over the G90 agreement specific proposals. But I think more broadly, we need to continue the conversation on special and differential treatment that is meaningful for our members. And there could be an entire session on that, and so I will move in quickly. Second is that the WTO must deliberately recognize policy space. And I think you should not bind what you cannot foresee. And one of the reasons why the WTO has failed to agree on many areas is that you're bringing together a diverse membership and asking for agreements that presume in the traditional GATT context, that the interlocutors know what it is that they're binding. For many of us, the things that are being asked of us in bindings are things that we have not yet tested or implemented. So I think recognizing policy space, not as a bad word, but as a crucial and important context setting issue for how we make decisions would be important. Finally, I end on the post MC12 picture as I began by saying, we must preserve the rules-based system as a fundamental public good, not so much for building further the edifice of the WTO rule structure, which is important in and of itself, but preserving the foundation around which more economic assumptions are made than we realize. When our ministers of finance are projecting their budgets, they presume that tariffs external to our countries will move and be managed according to a set of rules. That subsidies, despite all the weaknesses of the agreement on agriculture, are done with certain predictabilities. So I think that we need to recognize where value exists and where new value is needed. Now, stepping back now to the present, I'd say that the WTO Director General and members have prudently set a modest set of goals for MC12. We've heard them, COVID-19 response, including in the Walker process, to which I shouldn't say Walker process, let's rethink it's dispute settlement, but the process being facilitated by Ambassador David Walker. And Mr. Keem mentioned that in his intervention. Fisheries subsidies, aspects from the agriculture dossier, which Edwina addressed, LDC outcomes, which of course is a perennial. Each ministerial, you say all of these things and LDC outcomes, and I think MC12 will be no different. Development outcomes, I think the jury's out on whether there will be any meaningful engagement on the G90 proposals, but I won't be detained on that. Alicia mentioned electronic commerce, which is, of course, critical for the present and the future, and we need to pay close attention to that. And then the question of work programs. One of the things about work programs is that they're often placebos. You put them in because you can't agree, and you come back after you have agreed them to figure out what exactly are you supposed to do with the paper that you took from your decision. So I think that we want to hope that the approach to work programs is deliberate, purposeful, and that there's intent to follow through on them. So what can we expect of MC12? I don't think, and I take note of what Elisa said about the mood, we have to understand that the divide among members is deep and fundamental. But that reality should not push us into continued stasis in the WTO. We need to figure out that there are things on which the divisions cannot be resolved quickly, but that shouldn't immobilize the institution in respect of other things that are not contingent upon the divisions themselves. We should move forward using the convening power and the bully pulpit of the WTO that has been energized recently to continue to make declarations on important intersections between trade and critical global issues. So trade and gender, trade and small business, MSMEs, trade and climate change. So I think that we should embrace this effort to declare on these things without necessarily seeking to create a negotiating agenda around them, which brings up a whole set of other issues, many of which would make moving forward, even to declare a sense of interest in these things, impossible. I recall a time when you could not introduce a subject for a seminar in the WTO if a member feared that it would touch and concern a potential negotiating area. That seems to have been overcome with the ways in which declarations are emerging, and we shouldn't take it for granted. We should embrace it. I would just finally make a link back to past ministerials. MC8, which had the agreed political guidance, is probably the most overlooked ministerial in terms of its consequential outcome. It had no declaration or decision of consequence. It had a document that was named politically to ensure that members didn't treat it as a decision. However, its key words, make progress where progress can be made, opened the door to what happened in MC9 and Bali. Bali, of course, was defined by the outcome on TFA, as indeed MC12 will likely be defined by the outcome on fish. So we need to look at the importance of multilateral outcomes and the validation of a ministerial, but also we need to look beyond that. And I've laid out some of the other things that would be included in the look beyond. I'm slipping now to the, just in terms of process. MC12 must avoid the Nairobi scenario of disengaged delegations and an unrepresentative caucus of major players shaping outcomes. It should also avoid the Bali near miss of failing to take account up to the very end of sensitive concerns of each member. And it should pause if it needs to ensure that emerging solutions are not aborted, as was the case in Buenos Aires. I'll stop there because I realize we're running out of time. Thank you.
Well, Ambassador, I'm going to allow you to finish your thought because I think some of you are thinking, and whilst you're actually concluding your thought, I just thought I would take the opportunity to just gather together some of the questions in the chat. I think there's still a kind of a uncertainty about some of the questions about where, in your view, if you can offer one or any of the panelists, what are the red lines? This is a question from Nancy Kichingwe. What are some of the red lines, I imagine, for CARICOM or developing countries in these negotiations? So more sort of defensively, where can we not go? And where, I would add to that, where are the offensive interests that we should be pursuing? I also see a question about the DSB and the current status of that, and what's really happening in terms of any movement there. We heard a lot after the Walker process, but it seems, well, the previous Walker process, but it seems as if there's stasis there. There's not much movement there either. There's a question about CARICOM's liaison with the African group. I guess in the lead up to MC12, how much of that positioning between the ACP is being focused on in terms of the positions we take in MC12. So I'm just going to open it off. I'm starting with you, Ambassador McCook, and I'm going to take us to 12:20 our time here, and just ask any of the panelists to weigh in on some of these questions we're seeing featured in the chat. But you, Ambassador McCook, because I think you already had the least time. Go ahead.
Thank you. First, on red lines. Typically, you don't say what your red line is in a forum like this, but it's more important, I think, for us setting like this to describe what is a red line and why a red line. Now, these are all voluntary negotiations. In our capitals, we send people into these fora to negotiate in our interests. So there's absolutely no way in which a delegate should bring home an agreement that puts your country or region's vital interests at risk. You're not forced to do it. So a red line should be any outcome that would force you into a situation in which you are in breach of the agreement before you start. So you can't agree to what you cannot fulfill. And if you're being called upon to do that, the others should recognize that you cannot accept an invitation to act illegally. The simpler version of a red line is something that threatens direct harm. So if you export something and it's contingent, and it's easy in market access, for example, and it's contingent on a certain tariff structure, anything that would cut your tariff to a level in which you'd lose that industry would be your red line. So I just offer that. I'm more interested in the tools sometimes than the product, because the tools can help shape more than one thing. And in this case, redlining is one of the most critical, and it can also be one of the simplest things to do because it is so black and white.
I think you
You're
muted,
muted.
Genevieve.
Oh, thank you. Sorry about that. No, I just wanted to know whether any of the other panelists wanted to address any of the questions that I raised from the chat.
Genevieve,
Go
let me
ahead.
jump in quickly. I think I would agree with Ambassador McCook. Red lines are red lines, but they're not always apparent, especially when you're in a dingy, dark room and there's a lot of pressure. I think the big players have all the power, and the little players have to take what they can get, even if it is not accommodating much of what they want. And so from that perspective, I think a red line for all of us from a systemic point of view is that we should not allow the basic principles of the organization to be changed. Consensus decision is one of them. And, you know, there's a few things that possibly could be in breach of that principle, including how the plurilaterals are managed. So the JSI is, of course, a necessary debate that we're having, but systemically, they have unintended consequences that, that will impact the ability of developing countries to really be competitive in a post-pandemic world. But more importantly, as we look at the fourth industrial revolution, issues around the moratorium are becoming much more important. And we have seen from our COVID experience how important e-commerce really is. And so we need to negotiate rules that are at least inclusive and that will allow us to develop our economies, our digital economies, set the appropriate frameworks. And so from that perspective, it's really important to understand where we fit into the rulemaking mechanism of the WTO. Those are very important. And I think finally, I reference, you know, a package composed of something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue. And this is quite correct. There has to be something for everyone. We can't dismiss the big guys in agriculture that says, well, you know, yes, we do give big subsidies, but look at you little guys, you guys together also may distort international trade. So I think let's be objective and balanced. This MC may not be an MC for big outcomes, but it will be at least a landing ground for programs and actions to be taken in the future to ensure that our organization is more inclusive, more balanced, and certainly on the reform side, reform is not a new issue in the WTO. We as members, as Ambassador McCook said, are responsible for the outcomes. And so ultimately we should ensure that the reform efforts are such that they include the aspirations of all countries, including the most vulnerable. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kima. Edwini, the last word is yours.
I'll just say a couple of things. One, I think I'll confine myself to agriculture in the case of red lines. Clearly, I think an area where Caribbean countries, ACP countries have laid down clearly a marker is 6.2. They wouldn't like to see 6.2 taken away. Article 6.2, what normally is called the development box, under which countries can give input investment subsidies to small farmers. I think this is a red line, and we are conscious of that. The developed countries are conscious of that. And I think they would like to target mainly in India, but not to take it away from ACP countries, because they know that they need to support small farmers. So if talking about red line in agriculture, I think that is possibly the brightest red line. On the issue, someone spoke about the Doha round. I think there is still a debate among the members whether the Doha round is dead or whether it is in intensive care. So it's very difficult to say. I mean, some of the members wouldn't like to even hear Doha round, although there are some subjects like agriculture, but even in agriculture, sometimes countries are careful only to refer to Article 20 rather than the Doha mandate. So it is a question where I don't think we can have a very clear answer as to whether the Doha round is still ongoing or not. For the developed countries, or most developed countries, the Doha round has run its full course, and they think that it has been superseded by events. So as I said, it will be very hard to say whether it is ongoing. For many developing countries, yes, but for a number of developed countries, they think the Doha round is not still, it has really outlived its usefulness. So that seems to be the view as far as Doha round is concerned. And it's true, I mean, I think ACP countries collaborate a lot. It's a force. I mean, over 70 countries. We do listen to them. In fact, in the agriculture negotiations, for example, when the chair even has small consultations, Jamaica is the spokes country for ACP countries on agriculture. So the African Caribbean countries collaborate a lot. And I think, you know, their presence is being felt mainly because they have the numbers, and it is very difficult to ignore what they come up with. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Well, thank you very, very much. I know it's been a difficult road to walk with this, although the seminar is entitled The Road to MC12. I think what is glaring is this is a difficult road to walk right now, especially because many of the speakers and the panelists here are in these very delicate positions where they can't say too much right now, but they've been very helpful, I think, in framing some of the issues. And if we listen very deeply, we can understand some of where the sensitivities lie. We will look forward to hearing from you possibly after MC12 to see whether any of the ideas that you've given here or the positions that your countries have taken, or in the case of Edwini, you know, your neutral position being in the Secretariat, whether any of the things that are to come would have been foreseen at a panel such as this one. Alicia is not here. She had to run off, as I mentioned before, but I'd like to thank the panelists. I'll leave it to Joel to do so, and thank the audience as well for listening in on some of these issues. You heard some of the newer issues that were mentioned, the plurilaterals, the health debate, the environment. Yes, they emanate from older issues, but they've certainly been sort of thrust into the limelight now with COVID and all of the new things happening on the global agenda. So many thanks to the panelists for teeing up for our next webinar, which will take place next week. And I'll leave it to Joel to close and thank everyone for being part of this wonderful first webinar. Joel, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jan. And I think the discussion we've had today does suggest that we do not have enough of these kinds of engagements. And looking at the questions from the audience as well, and apologies that we couldn't get through to all of them, but it definitely suggests that we should be having more of these types of engagements in the new year. It's my task really to thank all of the panelists. Mr. Kim, it's always good to see you. We miss you here in Geneva, and we hope you will come back to us at some point, hopefully before my time ends. Edwini, again, very, very happy to see you. And you do have very good friends in the Caribbean because your reputation precedes you. And I've heard very good things about you as well from being back in the Caribbean. Now I'm in Geneva, and hopefully we'll have the chance to catch up sometime soon. And of course, Alicia, who provides very good support to the ACP group in general, and Ambassador McCook, again, another voice of reason that is certainly missed in Geneva, but to the benefit of the Caribbean, of course. And we certainly look forward to all the skills that you have to contribute to taking the region's negotiating agenda forward, and looking forward to further discussions with you in the weeks and months ahead. So to the audience, panelists, Jan, my fellow collaborator on this initiative, until the 23rd, we will see you until then. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Joel.
Everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.